Chen Xing asked for 12 gates. The drawings came back with 5. He said 5 would not be enough, and he said it out loud, in a room where that was a dangerous thing to say. So they took him off the project. Then they took his title. Then they hung a word on him, rightist, and sent him away from the rivers he had spent his life measuring. He was right. It took 23 years to prove it, and the proof arrived, at night, in the rain, in a valley in Henan, where almost nobody was awake to see it coming. This is the story of a wall that people called the Iron Dam, and of the men who were told, in writing, more than once, exactly how it would come apart. Start with him, because he is the thread that runs through all of it. Chen Xing was born in Nanjing in July of 1921. He grew up in a country where the rivers were not scenery. They were the thing that decided whether a village ate that year. The Huai River basin, south of the Yellow River, had been flooding and drying and flooding again for centuries. People there did not talk about weather the way we do. They talked about water, the way you talk about a neighbor who has hurt you before. Chen studied hydrology, which is the science of guessing how much water is coming and when. It sounds dry. It is not. A hydrologist is the person who decides how big the hole in the wall needs to be. Get it right, and nothing happens, which is the whole point. Get it wrong, and the wall is not a wall anymore. By the early 50s, he was working for the Water Conservancy Department of Henan Province, and he was good enough at it to end up as chief engineer. That is where the trouble starts. 1950, the Huai flooded badly. The new government in Beijing announced a campaign to tame it. The slogan was simple, and it was everywhere. Harness the Huai River. What that meant in practice was concrete, earth, and speed. Dams went up across the basin. Not a handful, dozens, then more than 100, on rivers that had never been dammed before. The mood of the time mattered as much as the engineering. This was a country that had just come out of decades of war and wanted to show it could do something enormous. Enthusiasm was a political virtue, caution was not. Banqiao was one of those projects. It sat on the Ru River, a tributary of the Hong, in Shimantan, in the south-central part of Henan. Construction started in April 1951. It was finished by June 1952. 14 months, start to finish, for a structure that would hold back nearly 500 million cubic meters of water. Think about that pace for a second. Not because fast is always bad. Sometimes fast is fine, but because fast means the arguments get shorter. And the argument at Banqiao was about gates. Dam is not really a wall. A wall just stands there. A dam is a machine for letting water out at a rate you choose. The gates are the machine. Open them and the reservoir drops. Keep them shut and it climbs. How many you build and how big they are is the difference between a reservoir and a bomb. Chen Xing did the arithmetic and came back with 12 sluice gates for Banqiao. He was not being timid. He had looked at how much water the catchment above the dam could deliver in a bad storm, and 12 was what it took to get rid of it. The number that got built was 5. Every account of this repeats that figure: 12 requested, 5 built, and every one of them traces it back to Chen. Nobody has produced the original Chinese engineering file that shows the moment it was cut, so hold it as very well attested rather than sealed and stamped. But 5 is what stood there. 5 openings at the base of a clay embankment to drain a reservoir with a capacity of 492 million cubic meters. It was an earth-filled dam, which matters more than it sounds. Concrete dams can take a certain amount of water going over the top and survive it, sulking. Earth dams cannot. Water going over the crest of an earth dam does not just spill, it digs. Takes the top layer, then the layer under that, and every second it runs, it makes the channel it is running through bigger and faster. That process has a name in the trade: overtopping erosion, and once it starts in earnest, an earth dam has minutes, not hours. Chen knew that. Everyone building it knew that. The whole design of the thing rested on one assumption: that the gates would always be able to get rid of the water before it reached the top. Then came 1954, and the Huai flooded again. After that flood, Banqiao was reinforced. Soviet advisors were involved. This was the period when Soviet expertise was the gold standard in Chinese engineering. And the dam was raised by 3 meters. It ended up roughly 24.5 meters high, about 80 feet. Not a giant, as dams go. A long, low, grass-covered bank of packed clay with a concrete walkway along the top and a small parapet wall on the upstream side to stop waves washing over. After the reinforcement, people started calling it the Iron Dam. That name is the whole tragedy in 2 words. Nothing about it was iron, it was clay. Name went around, and it stuck. And once a thing is called unbreakable, people stop asking the question that keeps it standing. Ask a farmer downstream in 1960 whether he worried about the dam, and he would have told you it was the Iron Dam. Ask a district official, and you would have got the same answer. The name did the thinking for everyone. Chen Xing did not join in. He kept saying the same thing he had said about the gates, only now he was saying it about the entire province. His argument was not really about one dam. It was about the system. Henan had built its water plan around storing water rather than moving it. Reservoirs everywhere, spillways too small, drainage channels neglected. He warned that the network did not have anywhere near enough capacity to pass a serious flood, and that the water they were so proud of storing would come back for them. He also warned about something less dramatic and, in the long run, just as damaging. Hold that much water on flat farmland and the salts come up through the soil. Alkalinization. Fields turning white and refusing to grow. That is an unglamorous thing to be right about. Also the kind of warning that makes you sound like you are against progress. In the political weather of the late 50s, that was not a technical position. It was an offense. He was labeled a right-wing opportunist, a rightist, removed from his post. Here is the part that people skip past. Being purged in that era was not a memo and a handshake. It followed you into your housing, your food, your children's schooling, the way people spoke to you in the street. It was a decision that the country had made about who you were, and the specific thing Chen Xing had done to earn it was arithmetic. He had counted how much water could fall on a valley and how much could get out of it, and said the second number was smaller than the first. There is a version of this story where that is the end of him. It is not, because a few years later, the province ran into exactly the problems he had described. Waterlogged land, salted fields, a drainage system that was not draining. In 1961, they brought him back. Think about what that meant for the men who made the call. They needed the man they had disgraced, because he was the one who understood the water. He came back, and he said the same thing again, not a softened version. The same warning about spillway capacity, about a network built to hoard water it could not release. So they removed him a second time. That is the detail I keep coming back to. Not that he was ignored once, in the rush of a construction campaign, when everyone was busy and nobody was listening. He was ignored, brought back specifically because he had been right, and ignored again. By the mid-60s, the country had other things on its mind. The Cultural Revolution swallowed everything, including the boring work that keeps infrastructure alive. Inspections, maintenance, the unremarkable business of sending someone out to look at a sluice gate and write down what he saw. And at Banqiao, something quiet was happening at the bottom of the reservoir. Silt. The Ru carried sediment down out of the hills. The reservoir slowed the water, and the sediment settled where the water stopped moving, which is exactly where the sluice gates are. The gates were partly blocked. So the 5 gates that were already fewer than half of what the engineer had asked for could not even move what 5 gates should have moved. Nobody ran that number. Or if somebody did, it did not travel far enough to matter. And here is the thing about a dam that is quietly weaker than it looks, behaves perfectly. Every ordinary year, every ordinary storm it holds. 23 years of holding is 23 years of evidence that the man who said it was too small was wrong. That is how the trap closes. The dam did not need to be safe. It only needed to be lucky, and it was lucky for a very long time. Then in the first week of August 1975, the luck ran out in the most spectacular way the atmosphere is capable of. Typhoon Henan came in off the Pacific. Typhoons hit that coast every year. Come ashore, they tear up some roofing, they weaken, they die inland. That is the normal life cycle, and it is why a typhoon in early August was not by itself news. Henan crossed the coast and pushed inland towards central China, and by the time it reached Henan, it was no longer a typhoon in the technical sense. It was the remains of one, a huge, slow, saturated mass of air with nowhere to go. And that is the problem. A moving storm dumps its rain over a long stripe of country. A stop storm dumps all of it in one place. The remnants of Nina stalled over Henan. Then a cold front came down to meet them. When cold air slides under warm, wet air, it lifts it, and lifted air rains. Kept lifting, and the system kept feeding, and the whole thing locked in place, nearly stationary, over the hills above the Ru and the Hong. Right over the catchments that fed Banqiao and its neighbor, Shimantan. 3 days, from the 5th of August to the 7th, it rained on those hills in a way that had not been recorded anywhere on Earth. That is not a figure of speech. Near the town of Linjuang, the rain gauge measured roughly 830 millimeters in 6 hours. 24 hours, about 1,060. Both of those beat the world records that stood at the time. Over 3 days, the total came to around 1,605 millimeters. Try to picture what that means on the ground. More than 1.5 meters of water, arriving from the sky onto hillsides that had nowhere to put it. 1 day of that rain was more than the region normally gets in an entire year. Survivors describe rain so dense that it was hard to breathe facing into it. And every drop that fell on those hills was going one place, downhill, into the reservoirs. Now put the design standard next to it. Banqiao had been built to handle what the planners called a 1-in-1,000-year flood. Depending on which version of the standard you look at, that meant roughly 300 millimeters in a day. There is a second figure in the record, around 530 millimeters over 3 days, and I cannot tell you which revision applied in 1975. It does not matter. Both numbers were annihilated. The storm delivered more than 3 times the daily design figure and kept going. This is where the word 1,000-year does its quiet damage. It sounds like a promise. It is a bet, and it is a bet based on the rainfall records somebody had on a desk in 1951, in a country that had not been systematically measuring rain for very long. Years later, the minister responsible for the whole sector would admit that the standards used to calculate flood risk were themselves flawed. Not that they had been applied badly, that the maths behind them had been wrong. But on the 5th of August, 1975, nobody at Banqiao was thinking about statistical standards. They were watching a number climb, the reservoir level. The men at the dam did what men at a dam are supposed to do. They asked for permission to open the gates. On the 6th of August, that request was refused. And I want to be fair to the people who refused it, because this is the part everyone gets angry about too quickly. Downstream was already flooded. Villages, fields, roads, already underwater from the rain that had fallen directly on them. Opening Banqiao's gates meant pushing more water into places where people were already standing on their roofs. It was a real choice between 2 bad things, made by people who could not see the third thing coming. So the gates stayed as they were, and the rain kept falling, and the level kept climbing. On the 7th, they asked again. This time the answer was yes. Permission granted. Open the gates. This is the moment in the story where you can feel the whole thing almost turn around. The decision was right. It came late, but it came. Somebody in a room upstream looked at the numbers and said, "Let it out." The telegrams went out. They never arrived. The rain and the flooding had already taken down the telephone lines and the telegraph wires across the district. The permission existed. It was real. It was authorized. It was on its way. And it was traveling through a communication system that had stopped existing. There is a particular kind of horror in that. Not a villain, not a refusal, just a message, correct in every detail, dying somewhere on a cut wire in the dark. By the evening of the 7th, the region was blind. Dams could not talk to each other. Districts could not talk to the province. The people at each reservoir could see only what was in front of them. And what was in front of them was water rising faster than they had ever seen it rise. At Shimantan, on the Huai River, it went first. Shimantan was the smaller of the 2. The water came up over its crest by about 40 centimeters. 40 centimeters. Ankle deep if you were standing on it. On an earth dam, that is enough. The water went over the top and started cutting, and once it had a channel, it widened it, and the dam gave way in the dark hours of the 8th of August. The whole reservoir came out. Peak discharge at Shimantan reached something like 30,000 cubic meters per second. For scale, That is more water per second than most large rivers on Earth carry at full flood. And it was heading downstream into a landscape already at capacity toward other dams. At Banqiao, the water was going the same way. The crest of the wave protection wall stood at 117.64 meters above sea level. That little parapet was the last physical thing between the reservoir and the top of the embankment. The water crested at 117.94. 30 centimeters over, a foot of water, and the iron dam was finished. Accounts differ on the exact minute. Some put Banqiao's failure at around 1 in the morning. Others put both dams within 10 minutes of midnight, or half past. What every account agrees on is that Shimantan went first, and that both of them went in the dark, and that the people below them were asleep. That is the detail that does not leave you, not the number, the dark. When Banqiao broke, roughly 700 million cubic meters of water left the valley in about 6 hours. Peak discharge at the breach has been calculated at about 78,100 cubic meters per second. Numbers that size stop meaning anything. So let me put it another way. The reservoir did not drain, it left. The front of it came down the valley as a wall, and by the time it reached the country around Shui Ping, it had spread into a wave roughly 10 kilometers wide. 10 kilometers across, 3 to 7 meters deep, moving at speeds up to 50 kilometers an hour. That is faster than a person can run on dry ground in daylight. This was farmland in the middle of the night. The dark was the flood's ally. There was no warning siren because the wires were down. There was no evacuation order in most places because nobody upstream could send one. What arrived first, people said afterwards, was the sound. Then the water was in the room. Anything made of mud bricks simply stopped being a building. Whole villages went in one pass. The wave did not stop at the first row of settlements either. It kept going into other river systems, into other reservoirs, which were themselves already full. Those reservoirs did what full reservoirs do when a wall of water hits them. They failed too. Then the ones below those failed. By the time it stopped, 62 dams had collapsed. 62. Banqiao and Shimantan get the name on the story. But the disaster was a chain reaction across an entire province's worth of water infrastructure. The one Chen Xing had described. The one he had been removed from his job twice for describing. About 12,000 square kilometers of land went under. Something like 5.24 million houses collapsed. 10.15 million people were affected in one way or another. Those are the figures that survived the archives. And inside them there are two places you need to know about, because they sit side by side and they answer the only question that matters. Did a warning make any difference? The first is Shahedian. Shahedian sat just below Banqiao, close enough that when the dam went, there was almost no time at all. Roughly 6,000 people lived there. Shahedian had been evacuated. 827 of its people died. That is a terrible number, and it is a number that would have been almost the entire town. Now the second place, Wencheng commune in Shui Ping County, further out from the dam. More warning time, in theory, more distance. Around 36,000 people lived there. Wencheng had not been evacuated. About half of them died. Read those two side by side and the whole disaster reorganizes itself in your head. The water was the same water. The dam was the same dam. The rain was the same rain. Difference between Shahedian and Wencheng was whether somebody had told people to get out. That is what a message on a wire is worth. And it is why the failed telegrams of the 7th of August are not a footnote in this story. They are the story. By dawn on the 8th, the flood was still moving. And now the men in charge had to make a decision that has almost no equivalent anywhere else in the record. There were reservoirs further downstream, still standing, still holding, and now with a wall of water arriving. If those went in an uncontrolled way, the flood would spread into more populated country. So the military was ordered to break dams deliberately. From the air, aircraft were sent to bomb embankments and drainage barriers to open channels and steer the water where it would do less damage. One of the actions was around the Banqiao Dam, which held some 400 million cubic meters, and it was carried out to protect the larger Suya Lake Dam behind it. Try to hold that image. Pilots over their own country. In the days after the worst flood in its history, dropping bombs on the walls their own government had built. to make the water go somewhere slightly less catastrophic. That is not a plan. That is triage on a scale most countries never have to imagine, and it worked in the narrow sense that it kept the bigger dam from going. Meanwhile, on the ground, the situation was worse than the flood, because water goes down. Everything else stayed. Rail lines were gone, not damaged, gone. The embankments washed out beneath them. The roads had disappeared under mud. The area was cut off from the outside in a way that is difficult to picture in a modern country. People who had survived the wave were on rooftops, on the higher ground between fields, in trees, on anything that had stayed above the water, with nothing. No clean water, in the middle of an ocean of dirty water. No food, because the granaries had gone with the houses. By the 17th of August, 9 days after the dams broke, more than 1 million people were still trapped. 9 days. Aircraft were dropping food to them, and here is the detail that tells you how bad the coordination was. Roughly, half of what was dropped landed in the water. Half. Sacks of grain going into a flood, watched by people who could see them and could not reach them. Then the second disaster started, the one that killed quietly and does not photograph well. Standing floodwater over an area that size, in August heat, with no sanitation and no clean supply, is a machine for making disease. Dysentery. Infection. Then hunger, because the harvest that had been standing in those fields on the 5th of August did not exist anymore. Which brings us to the number. And I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a lot of retellings simply pick whichever figure sounds biggest. The truth is that nobody agrees. The official Chinese figure for direct drowning deaths is 26,000. A preliminary report by the Hunan Province Committee in August 1975 put the figure at 85,600. Britannica adds roughly 145,000 more from the epidemics and the famine that followed. Human Rights Watch, writing in 1995, cited around 230,000. A Discovery Channel documentary in 2005 used 240,000. The Economic Observer, a Chinese outlet, has published 171,000. The honest way to say it is this: at least 26,000 people drowned in the water itself. Most estimates of the full toll, counting the disease and the starvation that came after, run from about 150,000 to 240,000, which means the gap between the lowest and the highest credible count is itself larger than most disasters in history. Sit with that. There is no agreed number of the dead, half a century later, for one of the deadliest single events of the 20th century. And there is a reason for that. It was not reported. On the evening of the 8th of August, while the water was still spreading, the two most senior men who should have been running the response were somewhere else. Ji Dongquei was a vice premier, and Liu Zhenxun was the first secretary of Henan province. Both of them were in Luoyang. They were not there for the flood. They were dealing with factional disputes left over from the Cultural Revolution, the political business that consumed so much of that decade. Meetings about loyalty, while a province drowned. It is not that they refused to act. It is that the machine of government was pointed at something else entirely, and it took time to turn it around, and time was the one resource nobody had. Ji Dongquei eventually led the central delegation into the disaster zone. He is also associated with the decision that shaped everything afterwards. The coverage was suppressed, not softened. Suppressed. The largest dam failure in the world did not appear in the newspapers. There was no national mourning, no published inquiry, no list of the dead read out anywhere. In the affected counties, people knew because they were standing in it. 50 kilometers away, you could be told nothing at all. Henan and the rest of the world, it simply did not happen. Now think back to Chen Xing. By 1975, he had been politically rehabilitated. The label had been lifted, and he was working again, which is its own strange kind of ending to a purge, no apology, just the quiet return of your job. 5 days after the dams went, he was in a helicopter over the flooded counties, with a vice premier, looking down. I have thought about that flight more than almost anything else in this story. He is 54 years old. He has been removed from his post twice for saying that this exact network could not pass a serious flood. And now he is airborne over 12,000 square kilometers of water, being flown there in an official capacity to advise. whatever he felt, he did not turn it into a memoir or a public accusation. He went back to work on the water system and stayed at it. There was one senior figure who did say something. Chen Xing was the Minister of Water Resources and Electric Power. Months after the collapse, at a dam safety conference in Henan, she gave a speech accepting responsibility. The words widely attributed to her are that responsibility lay with the ministry, and that she personally had to shoulder the principal share of it. Cannot show you the transcript. The quote is reproduced everywhere, and I could not reach an archival original, so take it as reported rather than sealed. But her later admission is better documented, and it is the more useful one. She said the standards used to calculate flood risk had themselves been flawed. That is a bigger statement than it sounds. It means the dam had not merely been underbuilt against a known risk. It had been built against a risk that had been calculated wrongly in the first place, and then reinforced, and then nicknamed the Iron Dam, and then trusted for 23 years. For most of the world, that would have been the end of the story, filed, sealed, gone. It came out because of books. In the 1990s, a volume called The Great Floods in China's History was published, and it described what had happened in August 1975. The preface was written by Chen Xing, the same minister. That is how the first public account of the disaster arrived. Quietly, inside a technical history, introduced by the woman who had accepted responsibility for it. Then came the journalists. A writer working under the name Yi Su produced an account called The World's Most Catastrophic Dam Failures. It appeared in 1999 in a collection edited by the essayist Dai Qing, titled The River Dragon Has Come. Issa's chapter carried survivor testimony, the voices of people who had been in the water, and it was the piece that broke the story internationally. Dai Qing had already made herself unwelcome by campaigning against large dam projects. Human Rights Watch cited her as saying more than a third of China's dams should be considered unsafe. In 2005, the official documents on the 1975 failure were declassified, 30 years. That is how long it took for the paperwork of the worst dam disaster on record to become something a citizen could read. And in the same period, another voice came forward. Li Zuchun, of the Chinese Academy of Engineering, who had seen the aftermath himself. In 2005, he warned about something people had not thought about in 1975, that a flood on that scale now would run through industrial plants and carry their contents downstream with it. The flood of 1975 drowned farmland. The next one, he was pointing out, would drown chemistry. So what happened to the dam? They rebuilt it. Work started at the end of 1986 and finished on the 5th of June, 1993. The new Banqiao stands about 50.5 meters high, more than twice the height of the one that failed. Its capacity is 675 million cubic meters. And here is the number that says everything. The old dam's maximum discharge capacity was 1,742 cubic meters per second. The new dam's is 15,000, nearly 9 times more. That is the engineering verdict, written in concrete, without a word of apology in it. The men who rebuilt Banqiao did not argue about whether 5 gates had been enough. They just built something that could get rid of water nearly 9 times faster. And they did it on the same river, on the same ground, under the same sky. Chen Xing lived to see it. He died on the 15th of May 2009, aged 87. He spent almost his entire working life on the water systems of a province that had twice decided he was politically unacceptable for describing them accurately. There is a memorial near the site. There are engineers who make the trip, stand on the crest of the new dam, and look at the valley below it. From up there, it is farmland again. Villages, fields, roads, the ordinary furniture of a place where people live. You would never guess. That is the thing about water. It leaves, and then the ground looks like ground. The flood is not in the landscape anymore. It is in the design of the wall you are standing on. Every one of those 15,000 cubic meters per second of new discharge capacity is an admission. So is the height. So is the fact that nobody calls the new one the Iron Dam. And I think the useful thing to carry out of this is not a lesson about dams. Most of us will never build one. It is about what happens to the person who does the arithmetic and gets an inconvenient answer. Chen Xing was not a dissident. He was not making a political point. He counted how much water could arrive and how much could leave, found that the first number was bigger, and said so, and the system he set it to had no way of hearing a number it did not want. It heard an attitude instead, so it dealt with the attitude and left the number exactly where it was. 12 gates was not an opinion. 5 gates was not a compromise. It was a subtraction, and the difference was still sitting there in the hills above Juma Dayan in August 1975, waiting for enough rain. The rain came on hills that had heard the warning, through a man nobody would listen to, and it fell for 3 days. And then in the dark, it went looking for the shortest way out. Go back to the hills for a moment, because there are 3 days in this story that deserve to be walked through slowly. The rain that reached Linzhuang on the 5th of August did not behave like weather. Typhoon Nina had come inland and should have died there, the way typhoons do once they lose the sea underneath them. Instead, what was left of it stopped moving, met a cold front sitting over Henan, and settled in one place like something parked. For 3 days, the storms barely drifted at all. In 6 hours, the gauge at Linzhuang took 830 millimeters. In 24 hours, 1,060. Both of those beat the world records standing at the time. Across the 3 days, it came to roughly 1,605 millimeters, and Banqiao had been designed against a 1-in-1,000-year rain of about 300 millimeters in a day. More than a normal year's rain arrived in a single day onto a wall built for a fraction of it. You can hear a number like that and feel nothing, so try it from the other side. Every hour, water was coming into that reservoir faster than the men standing on the crest could account for any of it leaving. On the 6th of August, somebody asked for the gates to be opened. The request was refused. Not out of stupidity either. Downstream was already underwater, and opening Banqiao meant pushing more of it onto people who were standing in what had already arrived. That is the part of this with no villain in it. Somebody had to choose between 2 floods, and chose the one that had not happened yet. On the 7th, the answer changed and permission was granted. By then, the telegrams had nowhere to land. The lines were down. The storm had taken the communications, along with everything else, and the approval went out into a province that could no longer receive it. Somewhere there was a decision that existed on paper and never became an action on a river. And the gates themselves were not what the drawings said they were. Silt had been settling into them for years. Sediment had narrowed the openings, so even the 5 gates Banqiao did have were not moving the water that 5 gates should move. The subtraction Chen Xing had argued about in the 50s had quietly been subtracted from, again by the river, without a meeting, without anyone signing for it. Shimantan went first. On the Huai River, the water climbed about 40 centimeters over the crest, and 40 centimeters was enough. Water going over the top of an earth-filled dam does not crack it. It takes it apart from behind, a handful at a time, until the wall stops being a wall. Banqiao, the reservoir crested at 117.94 meters above sea level. The wave protection wall along the top stood at 117.64, 30 centimeters. That is the whole margin, a hand's width of air between a province and the small hours of the 8th of August, 1975. The water found it in the dark, and by then every man who could have opened a gate was either unreachable or out of options, or both. When the wall gave, the flow through the breach peaked at around 78,100 cubic meters per second. Set that against what the dam had been built to release on its worst day, and the design capacity works out at a little over 2% of it. For a few minutes, that river was carrying more water than any gate on it had ever been asked to imagine. And then the question that always comes at the end of something like this, who answered for it, turns out to be the one the record answers worst. There is no trial here you can look up, no verdict, no list of men who lost their posts over the 5 gates. The only person in the entire history of that dam who was formally, repeatedly, on the record punished for anything to do with it is Chen Xing. Twice. Once in the 50s, for the gates, and once again, after 1961, when they called him back. That recall is the detail I keep turning over. In 1961, the water systems in the province started showing problems, and somebody remembered There had been a man who said there would be problems. So they went and got him. He looked at it again and told them the same thing he had told them before, because the arithmetic had not changed while he was away from it. And they removed him a second time. That is not a system failing to hear a warning. That is a system that heard it. Went and fetched the man who made it, sat through him making it again, and decided the problem was the man. Right-wing opportunist, rightist. Those were the words that went on the file. Not that his figures were wrong, not that his inflow numbers did not hold up. Nobody ever seems to have argued the hydrology with him at all. They argued about what sort of person says a number like that out loud. And while that argument was being had, the dam was quietly acquiring the thing that did more harm than any of the paperwork. A nickname. Once you have decided a structure is iron, you stop asking what it is actually made of. And Banqiao was made of clay, packed earth, 24.5 meters of it, raised another 3 after the Huai River flood of 1954 on Soviet advice. Iron was a mood. Clay was the material. And clay is what the rain was falling on. If this one stayed with you, subscribe. There are more of these buried, and we bring them up one at a time.